The airport was buzzing with activity as passengers hurried to their gates, dragging suitcases behind them. Some were excited, some looked tired, and others just wanted to get to their destination without any trouble. Among them was Mrs. Thompson, a middle-aged woman dressed in a crisp white blouse and a pearl necklace. She walked confidently toward her assigned seat, holding her expensive handbag tightly, as if the airport itself was beneath her. The flight was nearly full, and passengers were already settling in, stuffing bags into the overhead compartments, adjusting their seats, and chatting with their neighbors. Mrs. Thompson glanced at her ticket and found her row. But the moment she saw the man sitting next to her, her face twisted in displeasure. Sitting there, calmly reading a book, was a well-dressed black man. He wore a neatly pressed suit, polished shoes, and glasses resting on his nose. His posture was relaxed, and there was a quiet confidence about him. Mrs. Thompson froze for a second, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. She glanced around, as if expecting someone to step in and fix what she clearly saw as a problem. Taking a deep breath, she pressed her lips together and waved down a flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said, forcing a polite smile, though her voice carried a sharp edge. "I need a different seat." The young flight attendant, a friendly woman with a warm smile, glanced at her ticket. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is your assigned seat. Is something wrong?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated, eyeing the man next to her again. He hadn't said a word. He simply continued reading his book, seemingly unaware of the tension growing beside him. But Mrs. Thompson's discomfort was obvious. She leaned closer to the flight attendant and lowered her voice just slightly. I can't sit here. There must be another seat available." "Right." The flight attendant frowned, sensing there was more to this request than Mrs. Thompson was saying out loud. She quickly glanced at the passenger list on her tablet. "I'm afraid the flight is fully booked, Mom," she said, keeping her tone professional. "There are no extra seats available." Mrs. Thompson's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked around the cabin again, hoping to find another option. But the plane was crowded, and no empty seats were in sight. Meanwhile, the man beside her remained calm, flipping another page in his book without reacting to the conversation happening right next to him. Passengers in nearby rows were beginning to notice. Some stole glances, pretending not to listen. A few exchanged knowing looks, sensing the real reason behind Mrs. Thompson's request. The air inside the cabin grew tense. Mrs. Thompson exhaled sharply and pulled her purse closer, as if preparing for battle. She wasn't ready to give up yet, but what she didn't realize was that karma was about to arrive, sooner than she ever expected. Mrs. Thompson felt a wave of frustration rise in her chest. She had expected the flight attendant to quickly solve her problem and move her to another seat, but instead, she was being told there were no options. That wasn't the answer she wanted. She let out a small sigh, trying to keep her composure. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice slightly sharper this time. "Can you please check again? Maybe there's an empty seat in business class or somewhere else." The flight attendant remained polite but firm. "I've checked, ma'am. The flight is completely full." Mrs. Thompson's fingers tightened around the handle of her purse. She glanced again at the man sitting beside her. He was still focused on his book, turning the pages as if nothing was happening. He didn't look bothered, nervous, or uncomfortable. It was almost as if he had seen situations like this before and knew exactly how they played out. The silence between them made her even more irritated. She wasn't used to being ignored. She cleared her throat loudly, hoping he would at least acknowledge her presence, but he remained calm, his eyes never leaving the page. A few rows away, another passenger, an older gentleman in first class, had been observing the situation. He was dressed in a comfortable suit and had a kind but knowing look in his eyes. From his seat, he could hear just enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. He leaned back, stroking his chin thoughtfully. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson was still trying to argue her way out of sitting in her assigned seat. "Well, can I switch seats with someone else?" she asked, looking around the cabin. The flight attendant remained professional. "You're welcome to ask another passenger if they'd like to switch with you," she said, "but since the flight is full, it might be difficult." Mrs. Thompson turned, scanning the faces of nearby passengers. Some were now fully aware of the situation, though they pretended not to stare. A few exchanged quiet whispers. Others simply raised their eyebrows and returned to their books or phones. No one volunteered to switch seats. She sighed, annoyed. She had traveled many times before, and this was the first time she felt so out of control of the situation. Normally, people would accommodate her requests without question, but today, things weren't going her way. The flight attendant gave her an understanding smile. "Ma'am, if you need anything else, just press the call button. But for now, we need everyone seated so we can take off." Mrs. Thompson pursed her lips, realizing she had no choice. With a stiff posture, she finally sat down in her assigned seat, her body tense. She carefully placed her purse on her lap and folded her hands over it, as if to create a barrier between herself and the man beside her. The engines of the plane roared to life, and the flight attendants began their safety demonstration. But Mrs. Thompson's mind wasn't on the instructions. She was still fuming, still trying to figure out how she had ended up in this situation. What she didn't know was that karma was already on its way, and it was about to arrive faster than she could have ever expected. As the plane continued boarding, passengers settled into their seats, adjusting their seat belts and preparing for the flight ahead. The quiet hum of conversation filled the cabin, but in row 14, tension still hung in the air. Mrs. Thompson sat stiffly, her arms crossed over her purse, her expression set in frustration. She refused to look at the man beside her, pretending he wasn't there. Dr. Carter, on the other hand, remained calm. He continued reading his book, seemingly unaffected by the situation. He had dealt with difficult people before, and he knew that the best response was often silence. He wasn't going to let someone else's attitude ruin his journey. A few rows ahead, the older gentleman in first class continued watching. He had seen people like Mrs. Thompson before, people who thought they were better than others, people who judged before knowing a person's story. He didn't like seeing such behavior, and as someone who had traveled a lot, he believed in treating everyone with kindness and respect. He called over a flight attendant, the same one who had tried to help Mrs. Thompson earlier. Leaning in slightly, he spoke in a low, calm voice. "I noticed the situation back there," he said. "I'd like to offer my seat to that gentleman." The flight attendant blinked in surprise. "You mean the man in row 14? The older gentleman nodded. "Yes. He deserves a better seat, don't you think?" The flight attendant smiled. She had been hoping for a way to make things right, and this was the perfect solution. "That's very kind of you, sir," she said. "I'll take care of it." She walked down the aisle and stopped beside Dr. Carter's seat. He looked up from his book, raising an eyebrow. "Sir," the flight attendant said with a warm smile, "one of our first-class passengers has offered to switch seats with you. Would you like to move to first class?" For the first time since the flight began, Dr. Carter smiled. He nodded politely, closing his book. "That's very kind. I'd be happy to." Mrs. Thompson, who had been listening to the conversation, suddenly turned her head in shock. "Wait. What?" she blurted out. "You're giving him a first-class seat." The flight attendant kept her smile professional. "Yes, ma'am. A generous passenger offered their seat, and we're happy to accommodate the change." Dr. Carter stood up, straightening his jacket. Before leaving, he looked at Mrs. Thompson and, in a polite tone, said, "Have a nice flight." With that, he walked toward the front of the plane, leaving Mrs. Thompson speechless. The nearby passengers who had witnessed everything exchanged quiet smiles and nods. Some even whispered to each other, impressed by how smoothly the situation had turned around. Mrs. Thompson, meanwhile, sat frozen in her seat. The very thing she had tried so hard to avoid had backfired in the most unexpected way. She had wanted to move away from Dr. Carter, but instead, he had moved up in the world, and she was left exactly where she started. And karma was just getting started. Mrs. Thompson sat in stunned silence as Dr. Carter walked toward the front of the plane. Her eyes followed him, disbelief written all over her face. This wasn't how things were supposed to happen. He was the one who was supposed to move, somewhere else, anywhere else, but not to first class. The flight attendant returned to her duties, helping other passengers, while Mrs. Thompson remained stiff in her seat, gripping her purse tightly. Around her, a few people exchanged knowing glances, some smiling quietly to themselves. Even though no one said anything out loud, it was clear what they were thinking. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Dr. Carter settled into his new first-class seat. A spacious, comfortable chair awaited him, along with a warm towel and a glass of sparkling water. The older gentleman who had given up his seat gave him a friendly nod. "Hope you enjoy the flight," he said with a small smile. Dr. Carter nodded back. "Thank you. That was very generous of you." The man shrugged. Sometimes people need a little reminder that respect goes both ways. Dr. Carter chuckled softly and leaned back, opening his book again. The tension from earlier was gone. He was now in a more comfortable seat, away from unnecessary drama, and could enjoy the flight in peace. Back in row 14, however, Mrs. Thompson was anything but relaxed. The more she thought about it, the more upset she became. How had this happened? Why had someone given him a first-class seat? She had expected people to sympathize with her, not reward him. She huffed and reached for the call button. Within seconds, the same flight attendant appeared. "How can I help you, ma'am?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated, trying to find the right words. She didn't want to sound too obvious, but she also couldn't hide her frustration. I was wondering if there's any chance I could move to first class instead," she said, forcing a smile. "I mean, since a seat just became available." The flight attendant remained polite, but there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "That seat was given to another passenger, and as I mentioned before, the flight is fully booked." Mrs. Thompson's face tightened. She wanted to argue, but what could she say? She had already pushed her luck once, and now she had no choice but to sit in the very seat she had tried so hard to avoid. With no other options, she let out a small, frustrated sigh and leaned back in her chair. The flight was just beginning, and yet she already felt like she had lost some kind of invisible battle. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, she folded her arms and stared straight ahead. She had wanted to prove something when she asked for a different seat, but instead, she had been given an unexpected lesson, one she wasn't quite ready to accept. As the plane lifted off the runway, Mrs. Thompson sat stiffly in her seat, her lips pressed into a thin line. She kept glancing toward the front of the plane, where Dr. Carter was now comfortably seated in first class. The thought of him sitting up there, enjoying extra space, better food, and special service, made her chest tighten with frustration. She had expected things to go differently. She had wanted the flight crew to quickly fix her problem, to move him somewhere else. But instead, he had been given an upgrade, and she was left sitting exactly where she started. Only now, she felt like the entire plane was silently judging her. The passengers around her had witnessed everything. Some had tried to hide their smiles when Dr. Carter got moved to first class. Others had shaken their heads at Mrs. Thompson's behavior. She could feel their glances even though no one said a word. It made her uncomfortable. She took a deep breath and pulled out a magazine from the seat pocket in front of her. She flipped through the pages quickly, pretending to read, but her mind wasn't focused. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Meanwhile, in first class, Dr. Carter was completely at ease. A flight attendant had just handed him a menu, and he was choosing between a gourmet meal and a glass of fresh juice. The older gentleman who had given up his seat smiled at him. "You seem like a man who doesn't let small things bother him," the man said. Dr. Carter looked up and gave a small chuckle. "Life is too short to waste energy on things like that," he replied. "People will always show you who they are. It's up to us to decide how we respond." The older man nodded, clearly impressed. That's a good way to look at it. Dr. Carter simply smiled and returned to his book, enjoying the quiet comfort of his upgraded seat. Back in economy class, Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably. She was still frustrated. But now, there was another feeling creeping in. Something she didn't quite recognize at first. Was it embarrassment? Maybe even a little regret. She hadn't expected things to turn out this way. She had wanted to control the situation, but instead, she had lost control entirely. As the plane continued soaring through the sky, she glanced around again. The other passengers had moved on, talking quietly, reading, or watching their in-flight entertainment. No one was paying attention to her anymore. Yet, deep down, she knew she would remember this flight for a long time. And whether she admitted it or not, she had just learned a lesson, one that had come in the most unexpected way. But karma wasn't quite done with her yet. The flight had settled into a quiet rhythm. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, and most passengers were now occupied with their meals, books, or in-flight entertainment. The tension from earlier had faded, but Mrs. Thompson still felt uneasy. She shifted in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her arms, then glanced toward the front of the plane again. Dr. Carter was seated comfortably in first class, sipping his drink and reading his book as if nothing had happened. The sight of him enjoying the luxury of a first-class seat made her stomach tighten. She had thought she was winning when she demanded a different seat, but now it felt like she had lost in the worst possible way. The flight attendants came down the aisle, serving drinks and snacks. When one of them reached Mrs. Thompson's row, she forced a polite smile. "Excuse me," she said in a softer tone than before. "What kind of food is being served in first class?" The flight attendant, unaware of the hidden frustration behind the question, replied cheerfully, "Oh, they have a wonderful selection today. Grilled salmon, fresh salad, and a warm bread roll. And of course, first-class passengers get complimentary dessert and drinks." Mrs. Thompson's lips tightened. She glanced down at the small plastic tray in front of her. Her meal consisted of a basic sandwich and a small bag of pretzels. It was fine, but compared to what was being served in first class, it felt disappointing. She had paid for an economy seat like everyone else in her section, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. If she had simply taken her seat without making a fuss, she wouldn't be sitting here, frustrated and uncomfortable. Just then, the flight suddenly hit a patch of turbulence. The plane shook slightly, and a few passengers gasped. Mrs. Thompson quickly gripped the armrest, her heart pounding. The pilot's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a bit of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We should be through this in a few moments." The shaking wasn't too severe, but it was enough to make some passengers uneasy. Mrs. Thompson wasn't usually afraid of flying, but in that moment, she felt nervous. She looked around and noticed that most people remained calm, including Dr. Carter. He was sitting comfortably in first class, still reading his book, completely unbothered by the turbulence. Somehow, that made her feel even worse. As the turbulence passed, Mrs. Thompson let out a deep breath. But the uneasy feeling inside her remained. She had tried to control the situation earlier, but now she felt powerless. She sighed and leaned back in her seat. For the first time, she wondered, had she been wrong? The flight wasn't over yet, but the lesson was becoming clearer, and karma wasn't finished teaching her. The flight continued smoothly after the turbulence passed, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the nagging feeling of regret. She had wanted everything to go her way, to feel superior, to have the luxury of first class without a care. Instead, she was stuck, feeling small and unsettled in her seat. Every time she glanced toward the front of the plane, Dr. Carter's calm and composed demeanor only reminded her of how wrong she had been. He had accepted the change with grace, never once showing any sign of frustration or discomfort. And now he was enjoying a peaceful flight in first class, a place she could only dream of reaching. Mrs. Thompson sighed and folded her arms, staring out the window, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on being in control. Life to her was about making the right moves, appearing polished and powerful, and getting what she deserved. But today, that sense of control had crumbled. She had allowed herself to act out of anger and prejudice, and now she was left with nothing but a sense of shame. She tried to distract herself by pulling out her phone and checking the time. Only a couple of hours left until they would land, she thought, trying to comfort herself. But the more she tried to distract herself, the more she kept thinking about what had happened, how she had treated Dr. Carter, how she had refused to sit next to him, how she had let her biases and judgments cloud her better judgment. As the flight moved on, the cabin began to quiet down. Most passengers had finished their meals, and the lights dimmed as people relaxed, ready to close their eyes and pass the time. Mrs. Thompson closed her eyes too, but sleep didn't come easily. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the lesson she hadn't been ready to learn. It wasn't just about the seat. It wasn't just about getting what she wanted or feeling superior to others. It was about treating people with respect, about letting go of old, outdated beliefs, and understanding that the world didn't revolve around her expectations. Just then, the flight attendants began making their final rounds before landing, handing out small bottles of water and offering last-minute assistance. Mrs. Thompson caught sight of one of them and waved her over. "Excuse me," she said, her voice softer than it had been all flight. "Could I please get some water?" The flight attendant smiled kindly. "Of course, Mom." As the attendant handed her the water, Mrs. Thompson's eyes drifted to Dr. Carter's seat once more. She could see him through the curtain separating first class from economy, reading his book, completely at ease. She took a sip of water and sighed. Perhaps, for once, she needed to let go of her need for control. She needed to accept that some things were beyond her reach, and maybe that was okay. As the plane began its descent into the airport, Mrs. Thompson finally closed her eyes, feeling a strange sense of calm. She knew her journey wasn't just about the destination. It was about the lessons along the way. And today, the lesson had been loud and clear. Karma had a way of finding its way to people, no matter how hard they try to avoid it. And sometimes, the best thing you could do was sit back and let it teach you. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels hitting the runway with a soft thud as the passengers began to stir. The bright lights flickered on, and the seatbelt signs blinked, signaling that it was time to prepare for landing. Mrs. Thompson sat up straighter, her fingers instinctively reaching for her bag as she adjusted her clothes. As the plane taxied toward the gate, she felt a strange shift inside her. The frustration she had felt earlier had faded into a quiet sense of reflection. The flight, though still uncomfortable at times, had given her space to think about what had really happened. The passengers began to unbuckle their seatbelts, slowly gathering their belongings as the flight attendants made their final announcements. Mrs. Thompson glanced around at the other passengers, her eyes briefly meeting those of the people who had witnessed the events unfolding earlier. Some of them offered small, polite smiles, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't bring herself to smile back. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face the judgment, or if she even had the right to. She took one last look toward the front of the plane, where Dr. Carter was now standing, preparing to leave first class. His calm, collected demeanor had not changed in the least. Mrs. Thompson had learned so much from him today, even though she had been too proud to acknowledge it at the time. She had seen someone handle an uncomfortable situation with grace and dignity, without reacting out of anger or pride. It was something she had never considered before. How much better life could be if you simply let go of the need to control everything, especially the things that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Dr. Carter looked up as he passed by her seat, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Mrs. Thompson opened her mouth, unsure of what to say. She had thought about apologizing earlier, but now it felt too late. Still, a part of her knew it was the right thing to do. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice quieter than she expected. Dr. Carter paused, raising an eyebrow in slight surprise. He had clearly not expected her to speak to him, let alone thank him. But his response was gentle. "You're welcome," he said with a warm smile. "Have a safe trip." And with that, he walked off the plane, disappearing into the crowd of other passengers. Mrs. Thompson sat back, her heart heavy but somehow lighter at the same time. She knew she still had a long way to go in changing her attitudes, but today had been an eye-opening experience. Karma, she had realized, was more than just a chance for the universe to get even. It was a tool for growth, for learning, and for understanding the consequences of one's actions. As the passengers filed out of the plane, Mrs. Thompson slowly gathered her things. She was no longer in a hurry, no longer desperate to escape the moment. She had learned something valuable, and she was ready to leave the plane with a different perspective. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she might actually be on the right path, one that started with self-reflection and humility. And as she made her way down the jet bridge, Mrs. Thompson realized that sometimes it wasn't about getting what you wanted. It was about learning when to let go, accept your mistakes, and grow from them.